David admits that his teenage years were probably no more special than most Singaporean kids back in the late 90s. Shopping for clothes at Far East Plaza, buying CDs at the old Tower Records, trying to sneak into clubs, and of course, school holidays spent at chalets. He laughs at how no one does that anymore. I don't want to sound like one of those old guys that goes on and on about what he used to do back in his day, though. He chuckles. I take the opportunity to ask about the tattoo on his right forearm. It's of a mahjong tile, one of those on which a Chinese character has been engraved. I recognize the character as Dong or East. He tells me that it's actually connected to his story, which of course is my cue to turn on my recorder and ask him to start from the beginning. It was the December holidays back in 1998, and David and his friends were on the cusp of young adulthood. They'd all received their O-level results just a week earlier. Most of them would be furthering their education locally. Some of them had opportunities to study abroad. A couple of them were even planning to jump straight into work. All of them, however, knew that this school holiday was probably going to be one of their last times hanging out together, even if none of them wanted to say it out loud. So, they decided to mark the occasion by booking a chalet over at East Coast Park. There were 10 of them at the chalet, including David's two best friends, Hadi and Joe, as well as his girlfriend at the time, Melissa. They had booked the chalet for 5 days, the first 2 of which were relatively uneventful. Most meals were lightly charred fare, like chicken, satay or prawns, eaten off paper plates around the barbecue.
Well, what can I do for you?
Music was constantly playing, either from David's radio, or courtesy of someone strumming an off-key cover of Wonderwall on Joe's guitar. And there was always a game of mahjong going on. On the third night, David, Melissa, and 2 of their other friends, Samantha and Aaron, were in the middle of one of those games.
I'll be waiting here.
It was around 1 in the morning, and no one had gone to bed yet. Hadi, Joe, and the rest of their friends were just chatting, mostly about their idealistic plans for the future. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until the chalet suddenly went cold. Not the kind of cold from a particularly chilly breeze or an air conditioner set too low, but almost like an overwhelming presence. Hadi was the first to notice and tried to adjust the fans, but it didn't seem to make a difference. That's when David realized that something was wrong with Melissa.
Right.
She had stopped speaking mid-sentence and had gone completely pale. She tilted her head down and started mumbling to herself in what sounded like 2 different voices. But David couldn't make out what she was saying. Suddenly, her head shot back up, and something about her had completely changed, as if the lighting on her was all wrong. Her skin was sickly green, and her eyes didn't seem to focus. And then she spoke. It was a voice that David didn't recognize, but swears to me that he'll never forget. It was still a woman, but she sounded older, much older. There was a hoarseness to her voice that simply couldn't have come from his usually soft-spoken girlfriend. She growled out a hello that got everyone's attention and stunned them into complete silence. Everyone, that is, except for Joe, who calmly back firmly, asked this woman who she was and what she wanted. David would later find out that this wasn't Joe's first brush with the supernatural. But in that moment, David was in complete awe at his friend's bravery. The spirit, it seemed, was impressed too. In something almost approximating a friendly tone, she said, wearing an unsettling grin on Melissa's face, that she wanted to play mahjong. Joe told her that she had possessed their friend, and again, as politely as he could, that she was not welcome there. The spirit, however, simply replied, "Then make me leave." Joe didn't respond to her. Instead, he looked pleadingly around the chalet. Samantha and Aaron had already stepped away from the table. But if the spirit wanted to play, then it needed people to play with. David followed Joe's line of sight and saw what his friend did. That despite having their futures ahead of them, in that very moment, the reality was that they were all still children. Terrified children. Eventually, Huddy stood up and, together with Joe, joined David at the mahjong table. David tells me that if the spirit possessed anyone besides Melissa, he probably would have stepped away from the table. I wasn't brave, he says, but I felt less scared with Huddy and Joe there. With her fellow players finally seated, the spirit reached out to the tiles in the center of the table. Before she started shuffling them forward, she said plainly, flashing the unsettling, ill-fitting grin again. She rose. The boys only nodded, as the sound of shuffled plastic tiles, hoarse laughter, filled the chalet. They played for hours. Everyone who wasn't part of the game barely moved forward. One of the boys even wet himself. Still no one dared to make a sound. By 6:30, the spirit's side of the table was piled high with chips, which she looked upon proudly. It was around this time that the spirit suddenly let out a satisfied grunt, a voice more peaceful than before, and then later David, Joe, and Huddy were unsure of what was going on at first. But then David noticed that the chalet's fluorescent lights were now mixed with the warm rays of the sun shining through the windows. It was dawn. The spirit had left. Melissa rubbed the sleep from her eyes and asked what had happened. That morning, with 2 days remaining on their book, 10 friends packed up and left. For years after, I never went back to that area, David says. He knew the whole stretch had been remembered in the early 2000s, and that all those familiar chalets were gone. When he finally decided to check out the area again a few years ago, it was a jarring experience for him. Certainly, though not entirely for the reasons he had expected. Standing there, watching as a whole new generation of teenagers whiled away the holidays, hopeful for the future that awaited them, he found himself filled with a mix of disorientation, the same sense of relief he had felt on that night came to him. A strange longing, longing for the skies always seemed clearer to him, longing for barbecues and band acoustic Wonderwall covers. That's when I finally realized that David's tattoo wasn't a reminder of his entertainment. It was a reminder of his life before it. Nasri, in their second interview on this Hungry Ghost family, arrives just as my first interviewee, Gary, is leaving. They exchange some pleasantries, but don't really say much else to each other, since Gary has to head home to his family. If they did speak for a while longer, however, they'd realize they have a fair bit in common. Like Gary, Nasri's here to share a couple of encounters he had during this time of the year, when the barriers between our world and that of the supernatural are at their thinnest. And just like Gary, Nasri's encounters happened during his basic military training and Kulanta. No matter how many ghost stories you hear about him, some part of you just hopes they're all nonsense. As he orders himself a table at the neighborhood coffee shop. Or, even if they are true, you at least hope that it never happens to you. Nasri is a lecturer at an arts school these days. One of the students, Adam, was a former interviewee of mine and has followed me on a couple of other interviews. Adam actually asked if he could join us tonight, and Nasri requested he might be here. I mentioned to the class before, in passing, that I've got some army ghosts. But it's one thing to casually talk about these experiences with students, a whole other thing to cross the line and have him hear the entire story. I personally know that Adam's made of sterner stuff, but I keep this to myself. Instead, I shift the conversation back to Adam's experiences. Two of them. You hope that it never happens. And then it happens one after another. Nasri says, with a laugh. With a smirk, I tell them that I understand how that can feel. He laughs again, and he looks slightly embarrassed. I give him a reassuring smile. And as Nasri's KO arrives, I switch my recorder back on and ask him to start from the beginning. It was 2007. Nasri and his fellow recruits were outfield in the jungles of Takong, away from the comparative familiarity of their bouts. Even though this was during the Hungry Ghost month, the recruits weren't given any instructions by either their sergeants or their rank officers. No warnings about being extra cautious, about apologizing to any spirits that might be around before relieving themselves while in nature, or about showing the proper respect to any statues or joss sticks or offerings that they might come across in the jungles. Nasri says that he knew, even then, this was not the norm, that his superiors were being lackadaisical in their duties. But at the time, he wasn't going to question the same people who could dish out punishment if he seemed too insubordinate. So, together with the rest of his platoon, he went outfield, armed with the right equipment, but without the proper knowledge. Those first 2 days, however, went by uneventfully. Digging shell scrapes, heating up their less than appetizing looking rations, holding onto their rifles for dear life so that they didn't get yelled at by their sergeants, and really strengthening the bonds between each other. It was grueling for the recruits, but it was mostly nothing out of the ordinary. Mostly. During those first 2 nights, some of us could have sworn we heard someone laughing out in the jungle, Nasri tells me. We chalked it up to just some overactive imaginations. We all knew how flimsy that reasoning was. On the 3rd evening, though, things changed. For one thing, it was unnaturally colder. The winds whipped at them violently, blowing over equipment and sending recruits huddling together for some sense of security. It was almost like the cold was attacking.
By order of the guild.
I mean, come on Tekong? Hell, anywhere in Singapore? No way that's normal, Nasri says. The chill, however, was only a precursor to what was to come. At around 8 p.m., Nasri was placed in charge of leading the men to the area where they dig up their latrines. Glamorous work, he says, with a humorless chuckle. 5 of his platoon mates found quiet corners to attend to their business. None of them apologized or asked for permission. In retrospect, Nasri felt like this was the final. Whatever was in that jungle, it was really reasonable up to that point, he said, a faraway look coming over him. They had given us 2 nights to show it some respect. Standing in a clearing, rubbing his arms as the weather seemed to grow colder, almost like the chill was closing in on him, as we suddenly saw a flash moving against the darkness of the sky. He didn't want to get a closer look, but he knew he had to. If whatever was out there would only feel more slighted. So he flashed his torchlight's beam into the darkness. I felt like the light almost in slow motion illuminating the oppressive, luminous surroundings inch by inch instead of more. Nasri knows that, but it suddenly felt that way at the time. Soon, the light revealed it was waiting for him. Out there, amidst the trees and the darkness, was an elderly man in traditional attire. It certainly wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't even maliciously playful. Somehow his lips stretched ear to ear. His yellowed hair. Behind all of that was anger. Wanted to run, but couldn't. I don't know. Yeah, something else. frozen. To make matters worse, the man started moving towards Nazri. You can't recall precisely how he moved, though. Sometimes I remember him just walking slowly. Other times he was crawling like a spider. Sometimes he was floating, and somehow it was all three. However, the man made his way towards him. Nazri definitely remembers what he did next. He prayed. He kept his eyes open the whole time, unblinkingly watching the man as he came closer and closer. Nazri couldn't bring himself to meet his gaze directly. Instead, he just stared at that hungry human, and he kept praying. And after what felt like far too long, Nazri couldn't keep his eyes open. He blinked. When he opened his eyes again, the man was gone. Finally, regaining control of his senses, Nazri yelled for the other recruits to finish up whatever they were doing. Together, they all quickly moved to where the rest of the platoon. Nazri tried telling his sergeant what had happened, but his superior just waved him off. It taking him too long. I just scolded him. He took. Honestly, after what I faced in the jungle, maybe Sergeant was thinking. But then he sighs and adds, I just wish it was the last thing I had to deal with that night. Exhausted from his ordeal, it didn't take long for Nazri to fall asleep in his shell scrape, even knowing what was happening. He figured that if the man really wanted to do something horrible to him, he would have done it already. And he did leave Nazri alone for the rest of the night, except to give him a warning. Around 4 in the morning, Nazri woke up to the sound of something moving on the shell sweep in front of him. I only remembered later that this was the demo shell scrape from Sergeant Heffron. He said, no one should have remembered. Groggy, Nazri opened his eyes and saw, for a second, that he saw a soldier standing in the shell. He didn't recognize the soldier. He was also not entirely awake, so he didn't think much of it. Still, he knew immediately that there were a couple of things wrong. For one, the soldier was dressed in the old classic clean uniform from the 60s. Another thing that stood out was that he had his rifle out and aimed. Nazri's buddy Vivek. Nazri blinked, hoping to clear out the flames, but where the soldier was a second ago, the elderly man stood instead. The man was not looking. Nazri was at least thankful for that. But, like the soldier before, the man was staring directly at Vivek. He tells me. Nazri blinked again. This time, the shell scrape was empty. I was ready to call it a nightmare, he says. I mean, it all happened in that state between sleep and consciousness. But then, when we returned to our bunks a few days later, Nazri shivers. He apologizes and says he needs another drink before he continues. I tell him it's absolutely fine and turn to call the drink stall auntie over, but then stop before I can wave to get her attention. Standing at the stall is a soldier. Not an NS man who's just come back from camp, but a soldier in a Temasek green
I heard from
uniform.
the others.
I guess back. No. A little too loudly. And Nazri asks if I'm okay.
Yes.
I quickly turn back to him to reassure him, to tell him I'm fine and that there's nothing at all to worry about. When I turn back, the soldier's gone. I pause for a moment. This isn't the first incident
Let's have another hunt with no surprises
since
today.
my accident. I thought I might have just been tired. But this is
Got something in mind?
clearly more than burnout. Something's going on. I decide that I need to explore this, to figure out what's happening. But after tonight, after I finished these Hungry Ghost Month interviews, I wave to the drink stall auntie, then turn back and as best as I can, keep up my brave front for Nazri.
Done already?
John is not my interviewee's real name. Using an alias was actually his one condition for meeting me this evening at a coffee shop in Tanjong Pagar. He explains this was important to him because of when and where his story is set. The old Hill Street police station has served several purposes since it opened its doors in 1934. John worked there in the early 2000s, around the time it first assumed its role as the headquarters for a government ministry. He left more than a decade ago though, and has since had stints at privately owned events companies instead. Right from the start though, I knew this line of work was what I wanted to do. He tells me. Events can be, and usually are, chaotic. I enjoy bringing enough order to make that chaos fun. He adds, with a smile. But as much as he loves this industry on a whole, John's own sense of purpose wasn't always as clear. When he had first joined the ministry, the greater cultural mindset was very old-fashioned. It wasn't just in his workplace. Everyone he knew understood that he worked long hours out of the love for what he do, but because that was what was expected of him. You stayed in late or went to the office on weekends. Because if you didn't, everyone else would keep you here slacking off. And when you're starting out, it can make things really tough. He knows this way of thinking is still very much the norm among a lot of people. But he's glad to see it's changing slowly, especially among the younger crowd. That said, however, it was this need to work ungodly hours and it resulted in John's incident. As our drinks arrived, copy for me, a table for him, I switched and I put it on. And asked him to stay. John had heard stories of building lots of insinuation, second-hand accounts from colleagues of sightings and encounters. It's told that even though precautions were taken to keep the building safe from the supernatural, it was still prone to the unexplained. John, however, mostly took all of these with a grain of salt. The office culture equivalent of hazing the new kid. Still, it couldn't help deal with the weight of working in a building that had been around for as long as it had. No matter what the sign outside says, how fresh the coat of paint is, the building will always carry with it its history, John said, solemnly. His office's long, narrow corridors certainly didn't help, particularly late at night and on weekends. And he was sometimes one of the very few people in the building. Most of us were seated in cubicles with tall partitions. As you walked down the corridors, you really couldn't tell if there was anyone else there. He said. It wasn't scary per se, just very creepy. If that makes sense. It was this sense of creepiness that filled him as he drove into his office's car park at midnight on one particular Saturday. I had just finished watching a movie with a couple of friends. John said. I had an event early the next day, so I went in to check my emails in case there were any last minute things. This was the early 2000s after all. Not like I could read my emails on my phone. The end. Up till this point, John had only worked late on weeknights and never been the last person to leave the office. So, the emptiness of the building seemed almost imposing. He knew that there were security guards stationed elsewhere in the grounds, which gave him some comfort, but not enough to make him feel like he was welcome to the building at that hour. John took the lift from the car park up to his level. Once he stepped out of the lift, he turned left towards his workstation. Thankfully, his seat wasn't all the way at the end of that long, narrow corridor, but about a third of the way. Nevertheless, he made a conscious effort not to look at any of the other cubicles, worried that his mind would play tricks on him, or worse, that he might actually see something. When he reached his cubicle, John switched his radio on and blasted it louder than he normally would. He then switched his PC on, and as he normally did every day, he headed to the restroom while the computer booted up. I can't remember what was playing on the radio, but it was a catchy pop song, John recalled. It helped me calm down a little more, so I sang along to it loudly on the way to the toilet. The entrances to both restrooms were situated behind the door. As the door shut behind John, he noted he could no longer hear the radio. He didn't think much of it at the time. After all, his cubicle was a bit of a distance away, and it's not like he would have noticed how soundproof his door was any other time. He finished up and headed back, only to discover that the office was completely silent. No music going down the corridor. I could feel the fear rising in me, but I tried to reason it all out. He said,
There's a trove of new data.
maybe the radio's battery died, he thought to himself. Returning to his cubicle, however, he learned that it wasn't as simple as that. The radio had been switched off. John switched it back on, and sure enough, it worked fine. So maybe there was someone else in the office. He took a moment to psych himself up, then stood up, and for the first time that night, looked around at the other cubicles. No one. No glow from any other computers, not even any sound of movement. My options for a logical explanation were disappearing pretty quickly, he says, with another chuckle, though this one's clearly tinged with unease. John admits that he probably should have left at this point,
I heard from the others.
but slightly sheepishly, he says that he couldn't bring himself to leave without at least checking his emails first. So he tried calling out to see if there was someone else in the office who happened to be working really, really quietly. Anyone out there? He yelled, his voice more strained than he hoped. No response. The silence was starting to make him feel oddly claustrophobic, like it had him trapped. As he skimmed through his emails, he gave the security guards a call to ask if anyone had come by and switched off his radio. They sounded confused and just a little worried.
By order of the guild.
No one had come up to his floor at all. Keeping his voice as steady as he could, he thanked them, hung up the phone, and shut his computer down. He then switched his radio back off and made his way to the lift. But just as the lift door opened, however, he heard the click of his radio being switched on. Instead of music, it was tuned to static. Static echoed down the long corridor. Static that screamed at him. In that noise, he could have sworn he heard a voice. No, not a voice, but a discordant collection of voices in different languages. They all growled the same thing. Leave.
I didn't even head for the car park, just because I didn't want to be alone any longer than I needed to, John tells me. Instead, he jogged over to Park Lane, where he hailed a cab to take him back home. Oddly enough, he found that he wasn't gripped by that same terror the next day at his event. He told a couple of colleagues what had happened and received either one of two responses. Some of them looked deeply affected, swearing to never work again no matter what. Others were almost desperate to brush it off and reason it away. I still keep in contact with lots of the people who were affected by the story, he says, with a smile that speaks volumes. John tells me that the reason his fear dissipated overnight seemed obvious to him immediately. Those voices weren't a warning, he says. At least, not totally. He thinks that while the spirits certainly wanted the building to themselves at that hour, they also were expressing concern for him. He realizes that he's probably projecting his own feelings onto the situation. Feelings he was already harboring at the time. But I'm happier now. He said. So, really, what difference does it make? I smile and tell him that I can't, and honestly won't argue with that much.
My last three interviewees for this Hungry Ghost Month evening are Rob, Liz, and her husband, Ashok. The trio have been inseparable since college, when Liz and Ashok met while studying in Australia. We ran in different circles before college, Liz said. Ashok, however, adds with a grin, what she's very kindly not saying is that she was the popular party girl when I was a bookworm. Liz gives Ashok a playful look, then says, and yet, for some reason, I always got better grades than you. Rob laughs boisterously at this, earning him glares from this Ubi coffee shop's other patrons. I'll never understand what she saw in him. I'm just glad she saw something, Rob says, slapping Ashok on the back. Rob was a Sydney native and Ashok's college roommate. When Ashok moved back to Singapore, Rob thought a change of scenery would be nice and looked for work here too. This was 7 years ago. These days, Liz admits that they don't see each other as often as they used to. She says, matter-of-factly, I work at SGH. Ashok works in Science Park. And this clown's in the CBD. It's not like we can do regular lunch dates. Still, she says that whenever Ashok and her do meet up with Rob, it's like the old days all over again. Just with less partying. Rob says that it was during these old days that their story takes place. It's a long one, but if you guys don't mind, I'd like to talk about what happened that first night. Rob says, his loud, jovial disposition quieting down a little. Ashok and Liz nod, so I turn my recorder towards Rob and ask him to start from the beginning. Back in 2015, Liz Ashok and Rob, together with 3 other friends, took a road trip up to Port Dickson in Malaysia for a short getaway. Their friend, Vincent, had booked a 4-story villa in a gated community for the group. The villa included spacious individual rooms for Rob and Vincent, a bedroom just for Ashok and Liz, and another for the other couple, Sheila and Mike. All that plus a barbecue pit, a pool, and a jacuzzi. It sounded like a dream, Rob tells me. But since we weren't a particularly religious bunch, none of us noticed that our holiday fell during the last weekend of the Hungry Will Summer. Things at least started out great though. The roughly 5.5-hour drive in the rented minivan began at about noon, and spirits were high all the way there. Everyone joked and laughed and good-naturedly argued about the playlist. As the evening neared, the group looked forward to seeing their villa first. Upon turning into the gated community, however, their mood took a dip. The villa itself was gorgeous, looking less like a cliched holiday destination and more like a mansion, bathed in the setting sun's orange glow. The villas that surrounded it likewise sported equally lavish exteriors. But what cast a shadow over the group, though, was that all these surrounding villas were unoccupied. No one said anything, but everyone seemingly came to the same conclusion. Something wasn't right. And after a while, Vincent tried to lift his spirits back. "Hey," he said, the cheeriness in his voice clearly exaggerated. "At least we can make as much noise as we want." Everyone chuckled awkwardly, and at least attempted to shake off that sense of dread. "We faked it till we made it," Rob says, shrugging. As the group settled in, things did genuinely start to brighten up. Wowed by the size of their accommodation and its amenities, the apprehension took a back seat to camaraderie, as everyone did their part to prepare their food for the barbecue. Satay, chicken wings, ota, and truffle corn. It was a relative feast for the friends. The flames from the pit illuminated their front yard, and despite the neighboring villas still standing ominously empty, the group at least took comfort in the warmth of the fire's night. With the food ready, everyone adjourned into the villa to dig in. Everyone except Vincent, who chose to stay outside and cook up some luncheon meat that he had brought along. Something about this didn't sit right with Rob though. That unease that he had felt earlier as they entered the gated community returned. While just minutes ago the fire provided comfort, now seemed to cast looming shadows on all the other villas. Rob tried to coax Vincent into staying with the group instead, but Vincent just waved him off. "I was contemplating whether I should join him," Rob says. There's the slightest hint of regret weighing down his tone. At least we wouldn't be alone, right? But I just couldn't bring myself to stay out there any longer. About 20 minutes later, Vincent came strolling back in, looking pleased. He'd cooked, prepared, and finished a luncheon meat sandwich and was now happily helping himself to some chicken wings. Seeing as his friend was no worse for wear, Rob relaxed a little. And the evening carried on without incident for a while. But as time passed, Rob noticed that Vincent started to look tired. Dark rings formed around his eyes. His normally healthy brown skin took on sickly green shine. Just before midnight, Vincent quietly excused himself and said he wanted to head to bed. The rest of the group jokingly chided him, but Vincent snapped back at them with a string of profanities. Liz, Ashok and Rob all agreed that they'd never seen him like that before. There was a viciousness of his tone, Rob says, shuddering at the memory. And as Vincent stormed up to his room, the rest of the group expressed their concern. A couple of minutes later, it was decided that Rob should go check on him, since the two of them were pretty close. Making his way cautiously towards Vincent's room on the second floor, Rob was once again gripped by that same feeling from earlier. That sense that something was wrong. He was about to knock on Vincent's door when he heard his friend loudly retching from inside. Rob tried the door, but it was locked. He started knocking as hard as he could, calling out to his friend. In between the continued heaves, Rob heard Vincent pleading weakly, "Help me." Rob started slamming himself against the door, trying to break it down. It wouldn't budge. He tried the doorknob again, not expecting it to make a difference, but somehow it was now unlocked. Rushing in, he found Vincent sitting on the floor in the attached bathroom, throwing up violently. The bathroom was covered in sick, mixed with blood and something else. Something stringy that Rob couldn't quite make out. But that wasn't his main concern at the time. Rob helped Vincent to the shower, where he washed him down, even as his friend continued throwing up. The rest of the group soon came rushing up after hearing the commotion. Liz grabbed some towels, and Sheila fetched the paracetamol she had packed just in case, while Mike brought up a couple of bottles of mineral water. And as Vincent's condition slowly started to stabilize, Ashok helped to clean up the mess in the bathroom. The whole incident felt like forever. It had only been a few minutes. By midnight, Vincent was fast asleep in bed. Exhausted from the ordeal, the rest of the group hesitantly agreed that they would discuss what had happened in the morning. Rob didn't sleep in his own room that night, instead opting to crash on the floor of Vincent's room, just in case. The following morning, Vincent awoke with a mild headache, nothing worse than a slight hangover. When his friends asked him what he could recall from the night before, he said that he couldn't remember anything beyond staying outside when everyone else went in. We didn't really get into the details with him, Rob says. We figured there was no need to freak him out, and, well, I know it sounds stupid, but we all tried to reason it away. Everyone just assumed that the luncheon meat had gone bad, Liz says, even though it definitely wouldn't account for the state in which we found Vince the night before. Still, we hoped that that would be the end of it, Ashok says, then sighs and continues. But on some level, I think we all knew that this was just the beginning. Rob, an Australian living and working in Singapore, has just finished telling me part of a story over drinks at a coffee shop in Ruby. Him, his college roommate Ashok, and Ashok's wife Liz are my last 3 interviewees on this busy Hungry Ghost Month evening. The trio had all experienced disturbing encounters during a trip to Port Dickson back in 2015, together with their 3 friends, Vincent and another couple, Sheila and Mike. None of them had noticed at the time, however, that their holiday had fallen during the last weekend of Hungry Ghost Month. Rob's just told me about how Vincent had fallen violently ill on the first night at their Port Dickson villa, throwing up vomit, blood, and some stringy substance. After cleaning up the mess and putting their friend to bed, the group had decided to brush it off. It's just a strange one-off incident. But on some level, says Ashok, I think we all knew that this was just a start. I shift my seat and my recorder slightly to face him. Ashok says that despite what had happened to Vincent the night before, the group decided the best thing to do was to go ahead with their scheduled plans on the second day of their trip. Go-karting, he says, with only a slight chuckle. That's what we got up to after Vince's mysteriously quick recovery. He sighs, regretfully, then continues. If only we had just packed up and left that morning instead. He stares blankly into the distance as Rob grips his shoulder supportingly. I noticed then that Liz, her hand in Ashok's, has the same far wheel. I give them a moment to collect themselves, then ask Ashok to start from his beginning. After an afternoon of go-karting, the group stopped by a cafe to grab some sandwiches and finger food for dinner. Just like when they arrived on the first evening of their holiday, returning to the villa on that second day gave them an uneasy feeling. All the surrounding villas remained unoccupied, and even the late afternoon's enchanting glow couldn't make up for the foreboding sense of dread that their accommodation inspired. After they parked the minivan in the driveway, everyone headed up to their own rooms to freshen up before their early dinner. Ashok changed out of his t-shirt and jeans into a singlet and shorts. Liz wanted to take a shower, but very quickly had a change of heart. From the moment I stepped into one suite bathroom, I felt like I was being watched. She explains, shuddering. Normally, I would have brushed it off, Ashok says, rubbing her arms soothingly. Paranoia? After the night before, maybe? Except, I could feel it too. Presence, just beyond the bathroom door. Without soaping up, Liz hurried out of the bathroom, dripping wet. In that moment, the couple looked at each other and just knew. After she had dried off and changed, Liz and Ashok headed downstairs. On their way down, however, they passed by Sheila and Mike's room and noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Still reeling from the eeriness that they had just experienced, Ashok immediately felt like something's wrong. Liz and him paused to knock on the door. Sheila had just finished a quick shower, Ashok says, but Mike had apparently already gone downstairs without a word. Ashok and Liz waited for Sheila to get ready before heading down together. They didn't mention anything about the presence they felt in their room. No sense freaking everyone out, they reasoned, if there was nothing more feeling to go on, albeit strong. As the three friends neared the bottom of the stairs, Ashok, Liz and Sheila nearly tripped and fell from shock. At the foot of the stairs was a pillar. Standing in its shadow was Mike, staring menacing at them. Sayang, what the hell? Sheila shouted at him. No response. Just an angry gaze. Ashok's frustrations bubbling to the surface. He chastised Mike furiously. Mike silenced him with a guttural snarl. And that's when he turned his attention to Liz. Silently, Mike raised his arms and pointed right at her. His snarl turned into an evil grin. Without thinking, Ashok leapt forward, grabbed Mike's arm, and Mike pulled free and just turned to walk away out the villa's front door. Ashok wanted to go after him, but Liz stopped him. I didn't know what Mike was capable of at that moment, Liz says. Soon, Vincent and Rob joined them. And after Ashok had told them what had happened, Rob insisted that they go out to look for him. Vince was out there all alone the night before when the illness struck him, Rob says. I didn't want to risk anything happening to anyone else. Ashok was still hesitant, more for Liz's safety than anything else. But just as they had all agreed to head out, however, Mike walked back in, looking none the worse for wear. He talked about the sunset and how beautiful it was out there. Like, nothing had happened. Ashok tells me, shaking his head. Ashok, Liz, and Sheila tried to question him, to ask him about what had happened earlier. But Mike genuinely seemed to have no recollection. As far as he was concerned, he just took a stroll outside to enjoy the view, while Sheila was taking a shower. Mike brushed off any further questions, and eventually, the group settled down for dinner. We still tried to hold on to this dying hope that things weren't as bad as they seemed. Ashok says, but there was no fooling ourselves this time. Everyone ate silently, the gravity of the situation finally dawning on all of them. When he was done, Mike wanted to head up to sleep, but Sheila awkwardly said she would rather spend the night in Ashok and Liz's room. Sheila seemed to be bracing herself, waiting for that twisted version of a husband to return. Ashok had tensed up too, prepared to leap in front of Sheila if Mike showed any signs of aggression. Instead, Mike just looked confused, then shrugged and said that he'd keep the door unlocked if she changed her mind. Rob and Vincent headed up next, each to their own rooms. And eventually, Ashok, Liz, and Sheila
Are you prepared?
retreated to the couple's room. They talked for a while, trying to reason out Mike's earlier behavior at first. A dumb prank, work stress finally getting to him, maybe even just a weird mood. No matter what logical explanation they came up with, though, it just didn't feel right. They decided that they would leave the following morning, 2 days earlier than planned. They had hoped that the other three would go along with this, but even if they didn't, they'd just call for a car to wait. Finally, settling on their plans, the three friends felt somewhat comfortable enough to get some rest. Liz and Sheila would take the bed, with Ashok laying out a spare mattress on the floor. Before climbing into bed, however, Liz thought it might do them some good to open the balcony doors. I wanted to just let some air into what was starting to feel like a very claustrophobic place, Liz says, with a heavy sigh. As she grabbed the doorknob, though, she jumped back in terror and screamed. She frantically called out to Ashok. She scrambled towards him. Ashok ran to her and asked what was wrong. She could only point shakily towards the balcony. Cautiously, he inched towards the doors, then reached out for the knob. What he felt wasn't ornately carved metal, but hair. Long, coarse, black hair wrapped around the doorknob, forming an almost cocoon-like shape. Ashok recoiled in disgust, but a moment later, a realization struck him. The hair. That's what the stringy substance in Vince's vomit was the night before. We wanted to get out right there and then, Ashok tells me. It was already dark. We all had a full day. Ashok, Liz, and Sheila remained huddled together on the bed the rest of the night. None of them had a wink of sleep. But thankfully, nothing happened to them. Nothing, that is, beyond the sense that they were all being watched. The following morning, Ashok explained to the rest of the group why they needed to leave. Much to his relief, everyone agreed. We packed our things as quickly as we could, hopped into the minivan and sped off, Ashok says, his voice shaking slightly. We didn't look back. Hell, we didn't even look out the windows. Last thing we wanted to see, all those other unoccupied minutes. He hesitates on the word unoccupied, and I can understand why. Everyone's silent for a second, and I wonder whether that's the end of the ordeal. But then, almost as if she senses my uncertainty, Liz speaks up. What we didn't realize then, she says, was that something followed us home. It's getting late on this chilly, hungry ghost month evening. My last interviewees tonight, Liz, her husband Ashok, and their friend Rob, have been sharing stories of strange encounters while on holiday in Fort Texas. When Ashok told me about how their vacation had abruptly come to an end, I naturally assumed that their stories would as well. After a short pause, however, Liz said, what we didn't realize then was that something followed us home. I naturally shift my attention to her and asked when exactly she knew that they would be home. She says that she had felt uneasy throughout the entire drive back to Singapore, but initially chalked it up to their experiences over the past 2 days. I think it was only when we hit Johor that I finally realized that it was something else. Liz reminds me that she had felt like she was being watched the afternoon before in their holiday village. As they got closer and closer to Singapore, that same feeling returned, only stronger and stronger. I was hoping that as soon as we crossed the causeway, things would go back to normal and I could leave it all behind, she says. She inhales deeply, bracing herself, I assume, to tell this part of the story. As she exhales, I tell her to take her time, and when she's ready, she can start from her beginning. When Liz and Ashok returned to their flat in Sigla that evening, it seemed like the presence had finally decided to leave Liz alone. She also acknowledges, however, that maybe being back in their own home brought some sense of comfort too. And honestly, I think we were just too exhausted to give it the attention it's clearly craving, she adds with a slight chuckle. Whatever the reason for her respite, the couple was calm enough to head to bed relatively early that night. At around 6 the following morning, though, Liz was awoken by aches all over her body. Struggling out of bed and into their bathroom, she switched on the lights to find bruises covering her arms, legs, and shoulders. She tried to call out to Ashok, but her yell was suddenly cut short. Only a terrified gasp escaped her lips. In her peripheral vision, Liz saw what looked like a child standing in the corner of her bathroom. She spun around in a panic. I couldn't get a clear look at the child. Finally, she dashed out of the bathroom to wake him up. Although he was shocked by her contusions, Ashok still tried to comfort her, assuring her that nothing had followed him. He told me that this was probably my body's way of struggling with the stress that we had all gone through, she says. She adds that while she understood what he was trying to do, she knew, even then, that this was more than that. Still, after about an hour, she managed to regain her composure a little. Since their holiday had ended earlier, she had 2 more vacation days to wait. She decided that this day was as good a time as any to run some errands she had been putting off. And after everything that happened within the walls of that villa in Port Dixon, she says, the last thing I wanted was to spend another second indoors. So, Liz put on a brave face, went about the rest of her day as she could. Wherever she went, her presence seemed to follow her. Sometimes it was nothing more than a prickling sensation on the back of the neck. Sometimes it felt like she was being watched from afar. And sometimes she could have sworn she saw that child again, always just out of her line of sight. That night, Liz told Ashok about her day. Together, they decided that they'd figure out how to deal with it in the morning. But once again, at 6 the following morning, Liz was awoken by aches. Instead of heading to the bathroom alone, this time she woke Ashok up too. Leery-eyed, Ashok rolled over in bed, then yelled out in fright. Behind Liz, just out of the corner of his eye, he saw the child. He managed to get a better look at the figure. Liz tells me, her voice getting a little quieter. It was just a little girl. While the shock of it initially frightened Ashok, what he was left with, however, was an aura of sadness emanating from the ghostly child. The couple quickly headed out to their neighborhood coffee shop. There, they weighed out their options, what they could do, before finally deciding to give one of Liz's friends a call. And that friend knew called him a master, as you could see. Liz explains. They headed to a temple that very afternoon, but the master greeted them at the gate. "You are welcome here," it said warmly to Liz and Ashok, and turned to a seemingly empty space behind them, and added in a neutral tone that you must wait outside. Inside the temple, the couple recounted to the master what had happened, and the incidents in Port Dixon right up to the encounters of the last 2 days. The master only nodded and listened. When they were done, he closed his eyes and remained in a quiet, almost meditative state for about half a minute. As the master slowly opened his eyes again, he revealed that the girl was just one of many spirits that dwelt within the villa. The master told them that almost all of those other spirits wanted to harm the couple and their friends. The girl,
This thing's a
however,
true data.
had protected them. When their friend Vince had violently thrown up, it was because one of the spirits had tried to possess him. The girl pulled the malevolent presence out before it could do any further harm. The hair wrapped around Liz and Ashok's room's doorknob. It was another spirit's way of marking them for its own. But the girl stood in its way. And as they sped off, the girl prevented the other spirits from latching onto them before she followed them herself. It's in that moment that I realize Liz wasn't bracing herself because the story was horrifying. She was bracing herself because it was heartbreaking. Turns out, despite everything that happened, we were really lucky, Liz says, with a smile on her face, even as her voice begins to crack slightly. The bruises and aches that Liz had received were the only way the little girl knew how to get her attention. She wanted us to bring her to Singapore, to get her out of that place and away from those other malicious entities, and finally to a master, Liz says. The master promised Liz and Ashok that he would do what he can to help the little girl
Right.
reincarnate. He said that since they were still within the Hungry Ghost month at that time, it might have been easier for the girl to at long last find peace. Nothing else out of the ordinary happened after that, Liz tells me. If anything, that night I had the most restful sleep I've had in the longest time. I ask if she knows what happened to the girl, and she tells me she isn't certain. But a few days later, she dreamt of her, standing in the corner of their room. I wasn't afraid though, Liz says. But more importantly, neither was she. Not anymore. The three friends finish their drinks and get up to leave. I thank them for their time. But before I head off myself, I pause for a moment to just take in this chilly Hungry Ghost Month evening one more time. The smell of burnt offerings still fills the air, long after observers had reverently fed hell notes into flames. I think about how busy I am during this month and find myself smiling, oddly enough. Yeah, it's great that I'm able to add more stories to my collection. For the more benevolent spirits, like that little girl. It's nice to know that this month offers them a better chance for their stories to be told.
Everything I'm about to tell you is based on hearsay,
Says Christian,
and a conspiratorial whisper. Christian is a train driver. It's a job he's done for 15 years, and he's done it well. But he admits it can get monotonous. Believe me, I'm not complaining, he tells me, as he takes a seat at the Cine coffee shop. Everything's thoroughly checked out. Everyone's safety is pretty much a given. But you know how this is like. When it's all running smoothly, people will look elsewhere for excitement. In most jobs, this means office gossip. For Christian and his colleagues, this takes the form of an unusual sighting. Which is why I needed to add the disclaimer. He explained. This is about as close to office gossip as we'll get for us train drivers. This story has been pieced together by a few of Christian's colleagues. I can't entirely vouch for it, but he's heard of me and what I do, and he thought that I might be interested in it. I tell him that I certainly am, as I take out my recorder and ask him to start from the beginning. It was 3 a.m. on a Thursday morning in 2013, and Christian's fellow train driver, Walter, had just arrived at work. Walter was set to drive the Sweet train that day. Sweet trains go through the whole line to make sure that there aren't any materials or equipment left on the track. Christian explained. Most of the time, these sweeps turned up nothing of concern. This Thursday morning was different. The way Walter told it to Christian, he wasn't surprised that he was being radioed by Ellen in the operations control center. Ops control sometimes would ask the drivers to double check something that they might have seen on their cameras. It's all this well-oiled machine, Christian says. The drivers, and ops control, and everyone else look out for each other. What did surprise Walter, however, was the hesitation in Ellen's voice. Christian says that they all know Ellen. She's usually very sure and confident. Normally, when she asks one of the drivers or the station staff to take a look at something, it's just to confirm that there's nothing wrong more than anything else. This time, however, something was definitely wrong. Walter, there's someone at the point machine, she said. A point machine, Christian tells me, is basically the machine that controls the track direction. Like everywhere else on the tracks, when there's a train running, there shouldn't have been anyone at the point machine. But that's what Ellen saw on her monitor. Clear as day, a construction worker standing at the point machine, staring directly at the camera itself. The construction worker, as Ellen told Christian, looked sad. But there was a blankness in his eyes, an emptiness that Ellen had never seen in anyone. Not anyone alive, anyway. For some reason, at that very moment, Ellen thought of bodies in caskets. Bodies that, no matter how well made up or dressed, were without a doubt devoid of life. Not taking her attention off the monitor, Ellen first radioed the station staff to take a look. After all, the point machine was within the border of the station. Ellen made the mistake, however, of telling them what she had seen. No one wanted to check it out. Christian says, then adds with a smirk, understandably. So instead, she radioed Walter. And she had told him what she had seen. There was a pause before Walter's response. Walter, Christian says, was one of those guys who kept his head down and did what he was told. Which is why his hesitance cemented her own fears. Finally, however, after what felt like ages, Walter agreed to alight the train and head over to the point machine. It was about 4:30 a.m. when Walter reached the location. He was filled with relief when he found nothing, and no one was there. He radioed back to Ellen to ask if she still saw anyone else there. She hesitated again. Later, Ellen would tell Christian that she didn't take her eyes off the monitor, not for a second. She barely even blinked. But the moment the cameras picked up Walter, the mysterious construction worker vanished. Right before her eyes. Ellen told Walter as much, her voice shaking so badly now that it washed away all of that relief he had felt and replaced it with sadness. Walter told Ellen that he'd look around for it, but every fiber of his being just wanted to leave, Christian tells me. As he continued to inspect the area, however, that sadness grew strong. It drove Walter first to tears. The longer he stayed there, though, he could feel his grip on sanity begin to slip. And the sadness warped into paranoia, panic, claustrophobia. Soon, Walter was so overwhelmed by that sense of dread that he didn't just want to leave, he needed to. Maintaining his composure as best as he could, Walter very quickly made his way out of that area. Walter, who was always the first to volunteer, who never shirked his duty, asked someone else to retrieve the sweet train that day. Christian finishes up his story and exhales a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He asks me what I think. I tell him what he told me at the start, that it sounds like a very interesting story, but it's hearsay. Still, he swore me to secrecy, so I can't get on record where exactly this happened. But from what I know about the area and its history, his story certainly seems plausible. As I tell him this, his expression darkens. He lets out another breath and turns away from me. I was hoping their story would have been enough, he says softly. But I guess hearsay just won't cut it. Christian tells me that a year after what happened to Walter and Ellen, he was driving a train through that area. Truth be told, he had all but forgotten about that incident. Walter and Ellen certainly didn't want to talk about it. Both of their reputations had taken a hit. Not a massive hit, mind you, Christian says. Just enough that every once in a while, they'd see their colleagues giving them weird looks. Christian then adds, quietly, myself included. While driving this train, however, he was suddenly, inexplicably, struck by a sense of sadness. Thankfully, he was so focused on driving the train that even though the sadness grew more and more, he was still able to fend it off. As he pulled into the station, however, he saw it. Just briefly. So briefly, in fact, that he doubted it for just a second. But he knew what he saw. Reflected in the window of the train was the construction worker. Standing right behind him, staring with dead eyes. Christian goes silent. I don't say anything either. I don't have to. That look on his face. This wasn't just a story or hearsay. This was very real for Christian.
Young man, can I get anything for you? Asks Augustine, cheerily standing up as I arrive at his neighborhood coffee shop in Clementi. I tell him that it's okay, and I'll call over the drink stall auntie in a bit.
This is a rare research opportunity.
He seems
Can't let it go to
hurt for just a moment, and I think I know why. I explain to the 75-year-old gentleman that it's not that I don't think he's capable. I just want to get settled down first before I order my kopi. He responds not with skepticism or defensiveness as I had expected, but with a hearty laugh and a pat on my back. My boy, don't worry. I'm not sensitive about my age, he says reassuringly. It's just that I've been in the hotel industry my whole life. Old habits, despite my best intentions, die hard. Augustine tells me proudly how, since his 20s, he's worked as everything from a cleaner all the way up to a general manager. He built a career that helped support his family. So, you can imagine how strange it felt to retire, he says. He has since learned to enjoy his golden years, though he does look back fondly on his time in hospitality, which is why he was so eager to meet with me. Everyone wants to know about celebrities or politicians I've met, but very few people ask about ghost stories, he says excitedly. This is obviously my cue to fish out my recorder, so I make sure to wave the drink stall auntie over before I ask Augustine to start from the beginning. In 1986, Augustine was working as a night shift front desk clerk in a Changi Village hotel. Back then, that neighborhood was, how do I put this? Pretty colorful, he tells me with a smile. Still, the drunks and good time Charlies never gave me any trouble. Or at least, more trouble than I could handle. It certainly helped. The hotel's staff were friendly and capable.
Seems to be leaking out in irregular
This was
locations.
Augustine's first job as a clerk, and his more experienced colleagues quickly made sure he knew that he was supported. I don't think I could have wrapped my head around all the admin work if not for them, he confesses. There was one piece of advice, however, that they had offered him early during his time there that didn't make sense to him. Well, not at first, anyway. They told me to stay clear of one particular room, he says. When he asked them why though, his colleagues would just brush him off. The closest he ever got to an actual answer was something Jaya, one of the older front desk clerks, had told him. We all know that a lot of this area is dirty. There are some places, though, they are dirtier than others. Augustine certainly wasn't a complete non-believer in the supernatural. Of course, I had heard some truly frightening accounts. We all grew up in the kampong. Who hadn't heard a ghost story or two? He says. But that's all they were to him. Stories told by friends of friends. Still, out of respect to his co-workers, Augustine tried his best to never put a guest in that room. Until one particular night. The hotel hadn't seen business like this in a while. Even when Augustine took into account that it was the mid-year holidays. They were pretty much fully booked for the next month or so and had to turn away a number of guests every day. Which wasn't a problem for me by this point, Augustine says. He had learned over the last 6 months how to speak to guests, to placate the difficult ones, to make himself memorable to the generous ones, to be invaluable to the ones who demanded discretion, and to be ever present to the ones with families. But there was one guest that he just couldn't turn away. A young woman named Natalie had flown in from Malacca because her mother had passed on. She had no relatives here, or at least none that would speak to her, and she needed a place to stay. All the other hotels she tried were fully booked too, and this was the last place left to try. Augustine couldn't help but feel sympathetic to her plight. After all, I had grown estranged from my own family over the last couple of years too, he says, his tone growing a touch more melancholic. When it was my mother's time though, I knew I wanted to be there. The only room available was the one that everyone had warned him about. He thought about how he'd feel in that scenario. If he was desperate to be at his mother's funeral and some hotel clerk wouldn't let him stay in their establishment only because the final room available was particularly dirty. Augustine passed her the key to the room and tried to get one of the bellboys' attention. However, they were either busy or, oddly enough, seemed to not even notice him. So, he escorted her up by himself. Augustine remembers the smell of the carpets that lined the hotel's corridors. They always smelled aged, he says, his nose even now wrinkling at the thought of it. Even the newer carpets, aged but mixed with the strong, sharp scent of cleaning liquids. However, the carpet on the 8th floor, where the dirtier room was, reeked of something else as well. Earth.
Let's let the Sacred take us where
It
we go.
made me feel like
Right. We
something
should mark our destination.
ancient dwelt on that floor, he says. On this night, as he guided Natalie to her room, that stench was stronger than ever before. The woman didn't seem to notice. Too much on her mind, Augustine reasoned. But he certainly did. And he definitely noticed the faint sound of growls and groans as they got closer to the room. Like a cross between a dying man and a ravenous beast. As they arrived at the door of the room, there was no doubt that the noise was coming from within. Every fiber of Augustine's being told him to run. He turned to Natalie. She was still lost in her thoughts. I hoped that if she heard it too, then I had enough of a reason to get out of there, he says. But looking at her reminded him why he had let her here in the first place. She had nowhere else to go. I reasoned that it was my imagination, that all my colleagues' warnings were playing tricks on my mind, he tells me. Her problems, though, they were real. Augustine turned the knob and flung the door open. The sound stopped, and for a brief moment he felt relief. It really was just all in his head. But then the sound returned. A growl and a groan, louder than ever. What was that? Natalie gasped. Augustine turned to her, just in time to catch her reaction change from confusion to terror. Augustine followed her line of sight back to the door. And from within the unlit room, something moved towards them. Even in the darkness, they could see it. Its face looked human, but indescribably hideous, covered in warts, welts, and pus. Some of its flesh was peeling off, and when it grinned at them, it bared gnarled, sickly yellow teeth. That wasn't the first thing that struck Augustine and Natalie, though. What caught their attention immediately was that it was very, very tall. It was crouching down to fit in the room, and even then, it somehow seemed like it was far larger than the space it occupied. It let out that growl and groan again, but this time it sounded maliciously playful. The creature was laughing. And that was when both Augustine and Natalie blacked out. When Augustine came to, he was in the staff break room, surrounded by his colleagues. Natalie, however, was nowhere to be seen. He kept asking about the guest he was with, but the only responses he received were blank, worried stares. The longer he waited for an answer, the more frantic he grew. Finally, Jaya stepped forward, gripped Augustine by the shoulders, and told him sternly there was no guest. I reviewed the CCTV footage of the night before I left that morning, and they were right, Augustine says thoughtfully. Augustine seemingly just walked up to the 8th floor all of a sudden and stopped in front of that room all by himself. After he reached the room, though, the CCTV suddenly went dark for about 20 seconds. When it came back on, Augustine was on the ground. A minute later, one of the bellboys found him and quickly alerted front desk. I told Jaya the whole story about the creature and about Natalie, Augustine says. He looked at me seriously and told me that I needed to see a specialist immediately. Don't go home, he said. Don't waste any more time. Despite being prayed over and blessed by the specialist, though, Augustine still fell ill and remained mostly bedridden for a week. When he finally returned to work, Jaya explained to him what had happened. The girl you saw, Jaya said, she died in this hotel last year. The girl was visiting town for her mother's funeral, but she had a heart attack in her room on the 9th floor, directly above that room. Augustine was more confused than ever now, but Jaya continued. I told you already, some places are dirtier than others. What you saw in the room on the 8th floor, it feeds on people, both living and dead. The creature, Augustine reasons, must have lured both him and Natalie's spirit to the room somehow. I was lucky, I guess, he says, mournfully. I suppose whatever that thing did, it has a far greater effect on spirits than it does on the living. We both sit silently for a moment before he shakes off the pall that's threatened to descend upon us. He notices that I'm almost done with my copy and gets up to head to the drink store.